Hi, and welcome to this UX to Design webinar. My name is Kristjana Dögg Jónsdóttir, and I'm going to be your host today. You might be asking yourself, why is this webinar actually in English? And that is because I'm born and raised in Iceland and not as familiar as I would want to be with the Danish tongue. So I hope you guys will bear with me today. But I've been working with NoSeeper for the last year and a half, focusing on B2B and B2C web solutions. Mainly as well focusing on other digital design aspects such as web app design, content design, brand identity design, where we take printed CVIs and kind of convert them into digital design. And last but not least, of course, we've been working a lot on UX and UI reviewing and benchmarking. But you also see that I'm not sitting here alone. I have my co-host with me.
Yes. My name is Michael, and I'm a UX and UI designer here at NoSeeper. I've been at NoSeeper for pretty much 4.5 years now, and many more years in the industry, going from commercial agency into the digital agencies along the years, and now I'm really focusing on digital design and UX. But before we start off this webinar, and Christian will tell you all these golden stories about how you should measure your UX, then I'll have a few practical stuff to tell you about. First of all, after this webinar, we'll send you the slides, so you don't have to ask. We'll send them to you, to your mailbox, or your digital inbox, actually, maybe not your mailbox.
That'll be nice.
Then secondly, you will have to, you're able to sign up for a digital cookie. Some of you guys might have been here before, you know this concept. We have a thing called digital cookie. It's a competition that you can win. We'll give you something, and in this case, we'll give you a UX and UI review of a part of your website, but we'll get to that later on. Last but not least, there's a chat, and you can ask all the questions you like during the webinar, and we have 2 skilled UX and design experts sitting in the chat, ready to answer your questions. I hope they will answer your questions. But feel free to ask anything, don't hesitate.
Yeah, and you can actually be asking in both English and Danish. Yes. So if you're not comfortable writing it in the other language, feel free. Either way, we'll be answering in both languages today, even though the webinar will completely be in English. But yeah, should we start? Dig in? All right. So here we have the webinar agenda, and we're going to be talking about 4 main topics. We have the UX data, how you're collecting that, starting the project from assumptions, collecting metrics and inputs, and then going into how you actually define your KPIs. It's important to know what the KPIs kind of look like UX design-wise. And then, of course, we're going to talk about the team, go into resources, what it looks like when you're working with a design team, doing the design process. And last but not least, we're also going to talk about when you've gathered all that data and, gone and done your project, implemented that on the website, of collecting that data again to be able to argue for what you did and how it's benefiting your company, and hopefully creating more leads and just a better digital experience for the user. And often we get these questions of why focus on UX and design? And there are multiple arguments on why you should be implementing that within your website. But if you don't focus on UX and design, I would say your brand reputation could really hurt from it, because this is the first thing that the user sees when they go on your website. And if you're not legitimate and professional when you go into your platform, who is going to trust you with their data, credit cards, information, and want to actually purchase? So having that really legitimate professional UX and design take on your website is going to help you create more leads. And also, when focusing on design, be aware that the user stays around average 1 minute and 49 seconds. So you want to wow them. And, we often talk about this, this pop design, sometimes that works because you need to get that, trust and that brand reputation working up when focusing on UX and design. So there's multiple factors on considering, probably way more, but these are the key intakes.
We all know this situation where we go to buy a certain product. We have 2 options. Who would buy from the sketchy looking web page? I wouldn't.
No, you should go shopping in Italy on their website. Yeah, that's a whole other thing. Yeah. Luckily, we're in Denmark. You guys make great design so far. But let's talk about why it's important to actually gather UX data. I think this is something that digital marketing does really well. They're so data driven. And I really hope that with this webinar, we can kind of, sell you on being more data driven. And the reason is when you start projects and you gather data and create a solid foundation, then you can actually argue for larger budgets. You can get your design prioritized. And what I often think is that people sometimes forget if they actually put in the time and effort to get that data in the beginning, then it's so more likely that you're going to be getting that web solution that's going to meet your users' needs in the get-go. So, invest early on to get all that revenue later on after launching that new website. But let's talk about how you do design changes within your website or redesign or just start a new project. Here's a project timeline that you can actually use. And this is like surface level. We're going to be digging a little bit deeper in this today by talking about, well, first of all, how you can pick certain metrics, work with them. And when you're collecting data, key points to kind of consider when doing so. We're also going to talk about analyzing data. And in section number 3, we talk about defining KPIs. And when you actually have, created that section of data that you've collected to kind of narrow down to a clean project plan by defining your KPIs and prioritizing them.
Mm. Yeah, and you might have noticed we have these little GIF symbols on section 1 and 3 here. And we know that can be confusing to work with these UX metrics. So we prepared a little handout for you guys that you'll also receive among the slides. First of all, in section 1, we'll give you an overview sheet with the UX metrics that are going to be mentioned throughout this webinar as a kind of like a cheat sheet that you can look at to get you started working with this. And finally, we'll give you a matrix map that'll help you when you're supposed to prioritize the KPIs. But all that stuff, you'll be digging into that later on, so you'll get the context to this.
But I think it's important to keep in mind that, it's the juicy bits that matter sometimes.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. But let's talk a little bit about the project timeline. So in stage number 4, actually, you're going to be looking a little bit into the project team and what external resources might you be needing. In stage 5, we're going to dig a bit into the design process and what that looked like and how to communicate, let's say, if it's an external source. We're going to talk a little bit about development, not as much as, that's just the entire process of making the project. And then number 6, we're going to talk about data collection and the return of the investment and how that can be communicated. I think that's a really big factor for teams. But overall, we want you just to kind of experience it with us today of what it can look like. And we're going to give some really good examples through in each and every stage. So let's dig in. But as we were talking about why UX data is really important and what sometimes happens when people start project is that, you start from assumptions. And that is a tricky place to start from. But as a wise man once said, Peter Drucker, what gets measured, it gets managed. And I think it's important to consider, and when you're driving your business, often you're so business focused and thinking about that revenue that you kind of forget that these are human and the other end of the website that are interacting with it. So by measuring that information, you can learn a lot. And talking about learning, I think looking into UX metric is an amazing tool to use. And maybe it's not something that's discussed a lot with inside companies, but I'm going to talk a bit about these 2 different types that we have. So UX metric is just basically how you can measure user behavior. So by having behavioral UX metrics, you can talk about or look into abandonment rate, conversion rate, how many page views you're getting. And most of these are quantitative type of data where you're getting the really hard data of numbers that are used within Google Analytics. But this, as you can also see within the behavioral type, you can see that there's task on time and task success. That's actually more focused on when you actually meet the users and you're doing like a more in-person type of testing. And that is actually also quantitative, even though there's more of this human kind of interaction. But then you also have the attitude UX metrics, and those are usually questionnaires where you're kind of getting the user to tell you, okay, we're not very satisfied with the process of paying for this product, or we're not very happy, or we are very happy about how that went. And that, for example, can be the loyalty NPS, or the system usability scale, and a lot of different areas within in this metric type of section.
Yes, I'm actually wondering if wouldn't you say that it would be a good idea to mix up these two categories and use metrics from both of them?
I think when, picking metrics, having the quantitative focus is like the revenue focus. For example, conversion rate, if the conversion rate is 1%, and then let's say you dig into some more of qualitative data of like getting the real pain points, then you can more arguably kind of say return of investment wise, you can say the conversion rate was here and we fixed these pain points that we got from this qualitative type of research. And now the conversion rate is higher. So having them kind of complement each other, it makes a fine kind of foundation to, argue for why you did what you did and why you spent your company's money doing what you did. So that is an important lesson, I would say.
Noted.
But when starting a project like that, it's important to consider the framework. So when you start, you're gonna, as I said earlier, you're starting from assumptions. And you might have a list of pain points that are going on within the company. And let's say one person is taking it on themselves to actually point those down. And you have a list, all the way down, just a big list usually. And what I would say is really necessary to do right now on starting this project is taking that assumption list, putting it down into categories. So if it's like a front page type of assumption, or if it's a navigation bar related or a search bar related, grab that, categorize that, so you have a better understanding of where actually you believe the most type of pain areas are happening within your website. And when you're done with that, you can start grabbing that overview sheet you talked about that we're going to be giving at the end of the webinar and combining them together and look, okay, we don't believe the checkout flow is really performing. How can we measure that? Oh, actually, we can use this metric, that's abandonment rate, to see where the user is leaving. So using that sheet next to each other is really important. And as you kind of grab that and start working with your UX metrics, be aware of the framework. You need to know the time frame that you're going to be collecting that data. If you need test subjects, if you're doing a questionnaire, make sure to gather those questions and keep a consistency when working with the metrics within the team.
So, do we have any risk here? I mean, what do people have to look out for when performing this research? Yeah,
I think this is a tricky part because when working with research and data, if certain things aren't performed in a consistent level, so let's say if we were in a company and we wanted to do a time on task and do that time on task with a think out loud like testing where we get the user to kind of express their pain points verbally as we're taking the time. Yeah. I think that would be really important that we had the same view on what does the task look like when it's completed. When we communicate what the actual test subjects should do, so that we're not like communicating differently and then they perform different type of task and then there isn't this consistency. And then it's also with questionnaires of being biased. It's so tricky not being biased because you, of course, adore your products and your website. And leading your user in a direction you want them to go to is not very beneficial, I would say. But here I would say also consider actually hiring UX research teams as an external resource. They're super valuable. If your team is not comfortable working within UX metrics, then getting them to kind of, assist you to gain that really clear, good foundation is must. But let's talk a bit about examples and, how this looks in, how it could look in the real life. So I'm going to be giving you some B2B example and a B2C example. And I've looked into our previous clients and seen which are the most common discussed pain points for those clients. And then I'm going to be picking one of more of a qualitative focus metric, and then one that's more quantitative focus metrics. And so we have our B2B client here, and our B2B client complains that their B2B shop is not performing. And they have just recently got their website up and going as a B2B from previous just being a catalog. And they want to know, from their customer care being extremely busy, they've talked the user talk a bit about it in the customer care, that they're not really happy about the checkout process. It's taking way too long. And then it's the usual of, not having the overview of your previous orders and your quotes and so on. This is a very important area when working B2B platforms. So this is the client. And for this client, website project has just been formed. So they kind of need to argue for a new budget and a new project. So the metric I chose for them today is a system sustainability usability scale. I don't know why I want to say sustainability. It's a keyword.
All about the green.
So a system usability scale where, you get a better overview of how your website is performing. So what this scale does is that you make 10 different type of questions, all related to how your website is performing. And that question is usually rated between strongly disagreeing or strongly agreeing. And then, the user you get scores from each and every question, and you get an average, and then average from the actual user amount to get that number that rates your actual website. And the reason why this is a useful metric is because this is actually an industry standard kind of framework that's been in the industry since 1986, I think. John started this, and this has been referenced in a lot of articles and publication. So comparing your website to that scale is a very realistic metric on saying our website is not performing. And as you were saying, that client talked about the B2B shop not be working. It's a new shop. So they wanted to kind of argue within their company of that shop needing to get updated or optimized. So you can see here that their actual score is 53. But as well, looking into the overall site performance, they also wanted to look into the payment flow, because they talked about in their customer care, there was a lot of mentioning that the checkout flow was not working. So what we wanted to see here is that we want to go into the cart abandonment rate. And why is this important for the user or the actual client here? Well, it can be very beneficial to say that if, for example, that user or that client, has a 3-page checkout flow, where is the user actually leaving within these areas? And knowing that can really give you that input of, okay, we need to look into this area. And as you do that, then you can perform some more qualitative take on it. But because they have all this data from their customer care, it's more clearer for them where they have to kind of meet these pain points that the user is expressing. But as I said, this is more of a quantitative take on UX metric, and it's really effective in knowing, because we don't want the user to leave the site. And this is actually where you start using Google Analytics to gain that more kind of a hard data. And there's multiple ways to put this up, but usually you create a goal within Google Analytics, you describe that goal, and it's in a funnel, and then, start getting the actual reports of the abandonment rate. But yeah, be aware that even though these metrics that I say are B2B examples, they can of course also be used with B2C clients. All the UX design metrics can be used with any type of industry. It's measuring user behavior, and we can't say that users are only B2B or only B2C. No. So I would say keep that in mind.
Yeah, and then benchmarking against numbers from the same industry in a way.
Yeah. When benchmarking.
As much as you can, at least.
Yeah, exactly. But B2C, we have a client here that we want to give example on as well. And the pain points that we got from, this is usually the B2C, they're so driven. I love their atmosphere. They're just like, we want more leads. But usually sometimes they don't bring up the pain points or why they're not kind of reaching those leads. But here we talk about a client that has an outdated CMS. So they want to update it to gain these new type of e-commerce features. And they want to get more, kind of to meet this promotional area, maybe some digital marketing within that, and get these more leads to convert on their page. And they believe that the payment system is not performing. And this is very common, with both B2B and B2C, that the payment area needs to be on top if you're going to drive those leads through. So the first metric that I actually chose for them is time on task. And here we are focusing on the payment flow. So they want to know, because as I say, their assumption is quite fluffy. It's just we want to focus on the payment plan, but we don't actually know what's not working, but the conversion rate might be really low.
Are we talking the whole checkout process or just the payment?
No, yeah, so they want to focus on only the payment plan.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically what they want to do with this UX metric is that they want to time how long of a time it takes to pay for their product. And here they can see, and this is like when they've already selected the metric, already done the data analyzing and found out that it takes the user 50 seconds to actually perform that task.
That is a lot.
Yeah.
Only looking at the payment.
Yeah, exactly. So there must be something going on that's not indicating the efficiency of a user flow.
Yeah.
And here you also might ask yourself, why is it relevant to, make a time on task? It's basic in a way that, the faster the user performs the task, the better user experience. And this can be done in an in-person type of way. You can, sit with the user and time them on the task, or you can do this, of course, online. Now that we're in such areas of like Corona, sometimes you can't always meet people. Then doing this online with a camera and a timer, that is also possible. But I think what is really important about this UX metric is that, if you know the amount of time it takes for the user to perform that task, it's so important to know why they are struggling. So doing a think out loud test here of looking into what are the pain areas. So basically, as you sit that person down, you say, this is the task. You start timing them and you ask them to, as they go through the task of expressing themselves on the actual pain points. And that could kind of give you the exactly what you need to implement those changes within the payment flow. But another thing this is probably the most important important, but the most used UX metric within the e-commerce world, and that is the conversion rate. Knowing how much money is streaming into your website, and this is basically, if you're not familiar with conversion rate, it basically is where a lot of users come into your site, and then a certain percentage of that user turns into a buying customer. And from that, this is a very effective way to kind of know the effectiveness on the e-commerce side. This is again a more of a quantitative way. So just measuring this wouldn't make a lot of sense. You want that qualitative approach of knowing the pain points. So here you can say, I would say time on task, and having those two together could really elevate of arguing what's going on with those pain points. And what considering here is that when you're measuring conversion rate, be aware of what area you're measuring in. So is it like the conversion, the entire website, or is it just the set category? And the more kind of direct you are with communicating this to your team, the more realistic the data is going to be that you're going to be collecting. But this client, the B2C client, had only 1% of conversion rate. But here, as we talk about the UX metrics and why it's important to use UX metric, is because we don't want to build the entire foundation of our project from assumptions. We don't want this fluffy statements of, I just don't like it, or I don't think it work. Now you're building it on concrete data that you've actually gathered from, testing your users or digging into quantitative data. And be aware of that UX metrics are for both B2B and B2C, and all these different types of metrics can be used to kind of measure the assumption that you have and gather that data and analyze that data so that you feel ready to start your project. But talking about starting a project. So once you got all that going, it's a lot of stuff. You probably feel super overwhelmed by all that data. It's important to start defining those goals, grabbing those KPIs and narrowing down what you're actually going to be doing within that time frame, that budget that your company is providing for this project. And if we go a bit into the project timeline again, here we're going to be talking about how you're going to define your KPIs. We're going to use the same B2B and B2C client to give you examples. And we're going to help you prioritize those KPIs.
With the matrix map that we'll send you afterwards.
With the matrix map, exactly. So what is a KPI? If you're not familiar with that term, it's basically built on these 4 components. So you have the metric, which is, for example, time on task, or the conversion rate, which we already picked previously, and then the current value. So you measured that data, you analyzed it, and we found it took 50 seconds to go through the payment flow. But now as we got that, we need to make a targeted value. We want to make a goal to reach certain level inside our project. And the targeted value is something we're going to start looking into today with this next chapter. And be aware to always give your KPIs titles. Yeah. So now if we go back to our B2B example, the client wanted to, argue for that they needed to put more money into the website again because it's not performing as it should. And what they kind of want to say is that, okay, we have already found out that we score 53 points out of 100, but we want to reach to 70. I think, to be able to see how the website is performing way better.
Yeah, but 70 just seems like a random number. Why is it that we decide to go on 70 as the target score for this? I mean, do we just grab a number that is higher than...
No, it's just a pretty number.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding.
Great.
No, I think, this is a good question. And actually, it has a lot to do with the industry. And when working and making realistic KPIs, you really have to dig around to see and use tools such as Baymart, NNG Group, and find out what is the average numbers. So for example, for the system usability scale, we have the average of 68 points. So if it's scoring below 68, then it's actually not performing really well, and you need to start researching and resolving that design issue or functionality issue within the website. But if, for example, it's actually scoring higher than 68 points, then you just need to maybe do minor implementations of the design to make it a bit more better. But we all know we love these fancy images that show us a scale and communicate everything better visually because we're designers. So here's the system usability kind of chart, how you can see how effective the scores are. So below 50 is actually not very functional. And you can see it's just like not acceptable at all in this really red color. But then kind of between, 60, 70 or like 50 to 80, it's marginal. So there's room for improvement. But what I would also kind of say is that, when you reach that 80 to 100, never assume you can reach 100. Because as I say, these are human beings. And I don't think, okay, if anybody managed to do that, wow, like give me a call. I would love to see that. Where you get like 100% score within that everybody is happy with the performance of the website. That would be really cool, I think. Yeah. But usually having an 85.5 is just like, excellence. You really want to reach that. That is the prime. But
it's just, so now I get why you selected 70 as the benchmark for this specific client here to go from quietly not acceptable to acceptable. But does it matter what business you're in? We're talking about B2B, B2C, and even in, let's say, fashion or grocery or whatever.
I think there is, if you look it up online, that you would be able to find narrow numbers of, what usually websites are scoring. But I think what would matter more here of making a realistic KPI would be the size of the project. Okay. If you are only fixing minor things within the website that, maybe might not affect a lot of, getting the user to experience that when they go on the website again. But if, let's say, you did like a whole redesign on the website, then I would get high. I would assume that your KPI would target a higher value than doing a smaller type of project. So I think this is really important to consider, because when doing KPIs, of being realistic with that. But if we talk about the other actual KPI example that we have, and that is the cart abandonment rate, of where the user is actually removing themselves from the payment flow, not being satisfied enough with what's going on. So what this client wanted to do, the B2B client that wasn't really happy about that took too long to check out. So they wanted to look into the checkout process. And 89% is 11% is actually turning into a potential payer, but then they want to actually go down to 70% instead to reach like 30% of actually being potential buyers. And this is because this is actually a really, average number, as you can see here, that Baymar did like a research on like 46 different type of studies where they gained the average score of 69.82%. That is the average documented online shopping cart abandonment rate. That's a mouthful. Yeah. But yeah, so as I say, here the industry plays a big role. Plays a big role within of like being able to understand what is the average number you're comparing yourself. And as you could see with both, this is the usability scale and the abandonment rate. We both like kind of made the KPI around the average, because sometimes when working with this and working with humans, it's just you don't want to shoot for the stars all the time. In a way, it might make you look pretty silly if you stand up there and you say, you know what, we are gonna turn, get the abandonment rate go down to 20% and getting users, 80% of users to start paying for the product. That, wow, I would also want to see that.
So it's all about pushing the boundaries, but be realistic.
Yeah, be down to earth. Yeah. But actually, and let's say, for example, our B2B client, they had a lot of data about their customer care. So they can easily kind of argue for what they would do to change this number to 70%. But let's take an example that you didn't have that qualitative type of data. And you would have to understand of like, where do I actually start? So you have this number, you have 89%. But how do I actually fix the checkout flow? Because I have no idea where to start because I don't have the qualitative data. That's yet again to look into some of the previous made research on, for example, this is Baymart 2021, and they have these top 4 indicators on the reason the people are kind of leaving in the checkout, and most of them being extra cost is too high. They're forcing them to make accounts and they don't want to make them, we know the struggle. Delivery was too slow, and now in Corona, it's just like through the roof. We want everything now, but that's fine. I think the industry has really met that demand. And then the checkout flow is too long or too complicated.
Yeah, and actually now that you mentioned the extra cost too high, which like it's a 50% even here, and actually it's become illegal to hide the shipping costs now recently. Early on in the checkout process. So, and I actually know that one of our fellow colleagues here, Sina, did a recent blog post for a website about this topic. And if I ask politely, I guess some of the guys in the chat could drop a link to that post that you can look more into that specific thing, because I think it's pretty relevant to look into, considering the yeah.
I mean, as I say, if you would start a project right now and you had this rate of 89%, looking into these 4 indicators, and especially like now it's illegal, it's a tricky part because the industry is changing a lot. So doing that research when doing your KPIs to make them as realistic as possible, to meet your users' demand, there's a lot of work that goes into it, but it's all necessary because you know what? We all want to get the user to have the best experience, right? But that was the B2B example on how they kind of turned their UX metrics data into real efficient KPIs. And let's look into the B2C. And that client wanted to update their CMS to get really new and cool type of features for their e-commerce site. And then as well, they were talking about their payment flow not being very efficient and wanting to convert to more leads. So the first task on time metric, we talked about being 50 seconds to go through the payment flow. And here they have decided that they want to reach 20 seconds. And this is actually a rather tricky UX metric because online, I wouldn't say you're very capable of finding an average with this in a way, because payment flows can differ between type of industry, page types, niches, and so on, and just depending on the payment company that you work with. So here, what I would recommend you to do is that, get your employees and work with what you got. So take, for example, 5 to 10 employees, get them to purchase a product and time them as they're performing the task. So kind of use them as a test subject to get an average time on what is actually possible to do. So if they're possible of performing this in 20 seconds, having that as your targeted value with your KPI sounds realistic. But if you just make up a number and you don't know for sure if it's possible, then you might be in trouble if you don't reach that that size of a number. Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing when you mentioned the before is that you also need to consider the payment method being used.
Yeah.
Either it's you pulling out your credit card and have to put in all the numbers, or you're using mobile pay or Apple or Google Pay or whatever. Some of these are pretty fast checkout ways of paying for your stuff.
And I think and this really relates to kind of the project or the scope of the metric. So when they start doing this testing, they make sure to say, okay, this is the task you want them to complete, and they have this type of payment system, this many users, and then they time it. So everything is kind of consistent. But yes, be aware. And let's say that this client, does not have Apple Pay, because Apple Pay takes you like seconds and turns you into a shopaholic. Yes. So let's say that we don't have that right now. That's not included. But yes, but here we're not all. But here I think it's important to also consider the think out loud test. Because when you did that data gathering, when you had that metric, you learned a lot of pain points that were happening within that area of the payment flow, and that you're going to take with you when you start implementing the changes to the website. So then you have a list of tasks that you need to do, and then you can ask yourself as well, is it relevant, or is it possible to get that all fixed and reach these 20 seconds? And if the answer is yes, then, go for it. But then we also talked about the conversion rate, and the conversion rate goal that they have, or the KPIs that they want to go from 1% all the way to 2%. That's a brave jump, I think.
Yeah, but I would also imagine that the conversion rate would differ between industries. I mean, conversion rate between a fashion product, it's like a don't need product versus a grocery product where you need food, you need stuff for your household and stuff like that. Doesn't it matter what industry we're talking about in this case?
Yeah, it actually does. And similar, like with the other KPIs we talked about, it's important to do research here. So again, we are like very research focused today. Yeah. But this, you can actually see that the online shopping conversion rate differs between industries. Oh. And that actually, let's say that our B2C client was in active footwear. Let's say that they sell spinning shoes or running shoes. And what is I think really important takeaway here is that considering where you are at in the industry and going even deeper. I think you should also consider your target audience. Is it female? Is it male? What is the actual target age? Is it like older generation or the youngers, the Gen Z and so on? And the more niche you can go, to almost being like female spinning shoes for female in the age of 35 to 55, doing research on that to find the actual conversion number in an average will help you a lot. So let's say that if that number is, 4.5 and you're only reaching 2%, then that's maybe not a really targeted value to reach, and you might want to drive a bit higher, then you can shoot for the stars. Yeah, I think so. But now you're probably thinking, okay, we have all of these KPIs. It's a lot of stuff going on. How do I then now start prioritizing them and making a project plan to know kind of which KPIs will be performed within this project, within this budget, and narrowing it down? And that is kind of where we're going to start talking about the matrix map that you mentioned a bit earlier. And for people that do not know what a matrix map is, it's basically a visual tool that help you prioritize certain activities or projects or KPIs in a way that you have this lower line that focuses on the influence that task is going to affect on the user. So is it like low influenced or high influenced on the user? And then you have the kind of scale on if it's really difficult to perform or if it's not or easy to implement within the website.
Mm. Yeah, I think, and this is where you need to consider the team that you put together, because the stakeholder or the project manager can't do this alone. They really need to consider the skill set that is used for estimating stuff, so we don't go overestimate or underestimate in this process.
Yeah. I think this is a really important point to have in mind, is that when implementing stuff within web project, always have the developers, they know exactly how hard it's going to be. They know exactly when to often involve the design, if they need a mock-up or not. And having the design and UX team, having the development team, and then as well having the project leader of saying, okay, we actually, okay, this is an important KPI, but in this budget, we just don't have space for it. So, keep all these core resources in mind when having this meeting of prioritizing your KPIs, because it's going to save you time and money, and it's way more efficient. But let me see. So what we want you to consider when working with KPIs is that consider the industry take on it. What is the average going on within the industry, if it's related to conversion rate, if it's related to abandonment rate? And it's important to take in these factors when making that targeted value in your KPI. So you're either being very realistic or not shooting for the stars, as I've said previously. And having that in mind, make sure to prioritize your KPIs and having that team involved that needs to have a word in how difficult that project is going to be or how much influence it's going to have. And maybe important factor as well as needs to be mentioned, that when you need to know if it's going to influence the user as much as possible, you can use your data that you collected previously. So if the data talked a lot about bad, user experience within the payment flow or the checkout process, then indicating that's really influencing the user. So it's really important to consider that when working with the matrix map. But as you know, we made a little task list below where you can look into how to perform this as well, and move forwards with this entire process of strategizing UX and design within your project.
Okay. Take a breather, Christiane, and have some more. While you do that, I'll just again advertise for the competition that we have going on. There should be a pop-up popping up to your screen right now. Sign up for that and you'll be able to win a UX review of a specific area of your website. We'll decide together which area would be the best fit for this UX review, and while we do the review, we'll also give you concrete suggestions based on the review to where you can actually improve your platform. So please sign up, and it's a win-win, I guess. Yeah,
I mean, it's a great area of if you're starting from assumption and winning this review, you can start from that review.
Totally.
That is a
free of charge.
Yeah, hello. Want some winners here. But now that we've actually gathered all the data, selected the metrics, and defined our KPIs, and we have solid target value we want to reach within our project, created that project plan, I think it's important to consider who is actually going to be implementing and working on that project. So here you can see the project line again, where we have stage 4 of the project team, who are the resources that you currently have and which external resources might you need. And then in stage 5, we're going to talk a bit about the design process. And then you as well need to make sure that you do the development.
Development, you mean implementing the actual changes?
Yeah, so development just means that, you're taking all these KPIs, the fixes, the
using
pain points.
Using the development team to implement.
Exactly, and creating. But we're not going to talk about that in a way, because, we don't have 7 more hours, I think. So let's talk a bit about the resources. Here you have an overview of what project resources to keep in mind when doing a project like this. You have the leadership one, which is the project management. You of course have the research focused one, which is the UX research team. And then inside the development resources, you will be needing a development team, UX design team, and the digital marketing. And those 3 kind of hold hands on implementing or developing that project. And what I find is such a shame that there's these 2 extra, the content writer and the photographer. And I say extra, and that's such a shame because they're so important to the project. So let's say you're doing a redesign and having a whole new platform. The content writer and the photographer are essential to kind of create this atmosphere within your website that is very linked to the company. So often I feel like these are very forgotten, but so valuable resources. But when starting your project and having everything ready and picking a team, I think now it really depends on the size of the project. So if you're having a smaller project and you don't actually need maybe a full-on research team or a full-on management team, then it's just implementing some few changes within the navigation bar or so on, then just be aware that not all of them are needed. It's more to kind of give you an overview of what to consider when working on this type of project. But going from this type of project and the resources, working with the design team is then something we want to dig into because, well, this is a design webinar. So they are interested in knowing how actually the design process looked like. And here's maybe a good example on a very linear kind of design process of going from the user research on the collecting all those metrics and those insights, of having a valuable workshop with the team and the design team. Depending if it's an external team or an internal team, this workshop can go a bit differently. But then, of course, it's the design collaboration and then delivery, which is when you sign off the design, when you're happy enough with that performance. And then you do some quality assurance of actually Q&Aing with the development and making sure that everything is looking and performing as it should.
Yeah, I would actually say from a personal note here is that from my years of experience, I would say that it's important to be aware that not every design team work the same way, even though the design process is kind of the same. So knowing what your team expects of the design team is pretty important, and having that knowledge is important.
Yeah, I would say there are multiple ways of working with the design team. And it's funny because you might hire an external company, you know, like our company, and having us as designer, and we work very differently. So be aware. So when you're actually going into this design collaboration, and let's take the internal one first. So you're working with your internal design team. They already know your design. They already work with the web and so on. So then it's the question of these 3 stages that you might want to involve them. Do you want to have, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be throwing around some fancy words here. Do you want to have an agile design process? And that just means that you're being, you know, very involved of like having daily stand-ups, being actually inside the design sheet with the actual designer and seeing all the changes happening and having a lot of strong take on it and kind of signing off the design as it goes. That is one take. And then you can have agile/linear design process where you have maybe touch-based meeting in the beginning of the week and at the end of the week. So you kind of know what's going on, but you're not too much involved. But in a way, you're still more involved than if you do, for example, the linear approach. And the linear is where you just hand over the task to the design department. They grab it. And for maybe 3 to 4 weeks, they will implement the design to the mock-ups and, you know, present it to the team to know exactly what that's going to look like, and then do design iterations depending on how much feedback they're going to get. And yes, this can be a little bit differently maybe when you're working with an external company. So what Michael, for example, said previously is that consider how your team wants to work if it's an external resource. Because, for example, I have the tendency of working very agile with my processes, while maybe Michael has a more agile linear approach to his design processes. And it kind of doesn't matter if I'm agile or he's linear or vice versa. It matters what you want, what your team needs in relations of communication. So if you want agile, find an external source that does agile. But just make sure that this is communicated very early on, so you're not wasting time on actually going and signing off with an external source that doesn't work the way you want them to work. So keep that in mind. But as you say, when working with resources, it's important to know who's working with you internally, where do you need to seek out external resources, and keeping in mind that there are certain resources often that get forgotten. So, you know, make sure to go into every aspect of the project to know what is needed. And when considering working with the design process, you know, try to educate yourself about your team and how they want to be involved in that design process, collaboration, if it's an internal and external kind of take to it. But as you've kind of developed the project, the web project has now been implemented, created, and launched again. And this is where we kind of go, from, now we're kind of in stage number 5 or 6, but we're also kind of again in stage number 1, because we're going to be taking that platform and doing the exact same metrics here. So let's talk a bit about return of investment and certain things that might affect this process of collecting the data again within the new platform. So here you can see that actually return of investment is a performance measure, and it's actually used to evaluate the efficiency or the profitability of an investment. So basically your company takes a certain amount of money, invests that to the project. And then it's important for that company to, of course, know when all these implementations have been put into work and launched, on when that revenue is getting, reaching that 0 of the investment and then going above. Because that's what we want, right? We want to get revenue from making those implementations. But there are certain factors to consider when working again with UX metric and collecting the data all again and being consistent with the research of performing almost, the same task with the same amount of test subject with the exact same time frame. So here are certain things to keep in mind when collecting new data, is that measure from the exact same starting point. And what do I actually mean by that? It means that, let's say, previously when you were collecting the data on your UX metrics, you were collecting it around, let's say, winter time. So from October all the way to February. And that was the time frame that you measured the conversion rate or, the abandonment rate. And there's a lot of things that can kind of kick in here. Certain things as, Black Friday, Thanksgiving, people shopping Christmas gifts and so on, that can play a role in, conversion rate being a certain percentage. And then I would also say, consider that, you're working with humans. There's so many changes that can happen. If it goes from different buying behavior, you getting just different type of users into your new platform. They discover something through marketing. There's so many changes that kind of take part when considering this.
Yeah, I would actually also say that the things that you just mentioned is some of the factors that you can actually kind of plan ahead and plan into your calculations here. But we must not just forget unexpected external stuff happening. It could be like COVID we just had, or still have in a way, and weather conditions that might change a lot. You have a warm summer, and if the weather is like freezingly cold and rainy and stuff like that, that could affect a lot.
I would definitely say I shop more on rainy days.
Yeah.
So external factors play a big role when considering data. But if we now look into those same examples that we were talking about previously, digging into that B2B client, and he was measuring these 2 type of metrics, and now having to remeasure that data, what would that actually look like, and how do you communicate those changes to your team? So taking the system usability scale as an example, here you could say the targeted value was 70. And you can see now that in the top that the previous data was 53 and the conversion rate. And, keep an eye on that. Now I'm saying also conversion rate, because the indicator of the performance of the website is one thing, and the conversion rate is supporting that, saying this is the amount of money that was flowing within the company as this page was behaving like that. But now as you do the implementation, now your website is scoring 69, which is above average. Then you see that a conversion rate is now 2%. And that just means that performance on the website is better. Your users are happier. So the money that you now spend on that project is actually turning into profitable, return of investment. And actually also looking into the cart abandonment, it's important to see that, we're in fairy tale life that everybody's reaching their KPIs, which might maybe not be super realistic, but we are in a good mood today. So let's say that they reached their 70%. And now there's actually 30% of the users coming into the site are converting into actual paying customer. But let's take an example if this actually was not 70%. Let's say they went from 89% down to 85%. And you have to stand in front of your entire team and say, yeah, we actually just, we spent a lot of money on this project, but we actually just went down to 85%. then I want you to remember that slide that we just talked about, where these external factors play a role, and also these factors of seasonal, promotional days, and that we're working with humans. You know, just be humble up there. It's important because we all want you to give the best communication. But if we actually go from this more of approach of B2B, then you can look into the B2C client. And the B2C was the one client that wanted to change and update their CMS, get more of these features for the platform and look into the payment flow. And they measured the time on task with the payment flow. And as I said earlier, that this is a tricky UX metric, but what I think it's so much fun with this metric is that, yes, let's see here that they actually reached these 24 seconds. But what might happen here is that they're going to do the think out loud test again, and they might actually discover some new pain points. But be aware and don't panic when certain things like that happen. It doesn't mean that you have to grab that data right away and implement and do more budgeting projects and changes. You can use that for a different time frame. It's just, you know, because certain things can always pop up. And then going from the conversion rate, yet again, I'm going to improvise on that. You're either measuring the conversion rate on the website, or you're looking into the conversion rate on a certain type of category. And when working, you know, for example, here you can say the amount of users like coming in are now turning into these potential buyers. And we went from 1% to 2%. For a certain amount of people, that doesn't look like a lot, but showing the actual numbers of the users that are now buying could really help communicate to your team that there's a lot of happening, and going to 2% is actually a major step for your team. So be aware when measuring data, again, on your new platform, be humble, because you know that there are a lot of different factors playing a role within, you know, externally, if it's Corona, great weather, or if you're make sure to start on the same starting point of, you know, the same time frame. If you started to measure your data in summer, do it over summer again, or vice versa. But I think what is important to kind of look into here is the communication. Be very transparent and, you know, get the real data out there. Even if it's not good data, it's still data, and you're gaining way more knowledge about the user. So
that's almost it, Christina. So, and before we end this, once again, I'll just quickly announce or advertise for this competition that we have going on. So again, this should be a popping up on your screen. And again, this is a UX review that you can win. We'll look into a specific area of your website, and we'll give you concrete suggestions to where you could actually improve on that specific area. Yeah.
And learn on new things about your website that you just didn't know.
No. There was a lot of interesting stuff. There was a lot of numbers coming out here from you. I'm a bit overwhelmed, and I guess some of you out there as well. So could you just sum up a bit here for us at the end?
Yeah, I think that's very necessary. So why design? Why UX? Because you want to know and implement that user behavior, this, you know, legitimate professional website for your users to get them to buy your product. It's important to consider that you're collecting data to build up solid foundation for your project. And when collecting data, you're working with UX metrics, and that can be a tricky tool of measuring data and looking into these areas of human behavior, because, you know, we're so different when working with human behavior. And what I would also say when working with that data, try not to be biased. Try to, if you need an external team researching on that, hire that team, or make sure that you look for all those industry standards within that data. Going from that data, make your KPIs, be realistic with your KPIs, because it's important that you're not reaching for the stars or not estimating what you're able to do with your optimization. And when you have all your KPIs, prioritize them. Pick the right teammates to be there, to be legitimate, save time and money on your budget by doing it right the first way. Consider your teammates and the design process. Make sure when you're communicating with the design external team or internal team on how you want to be involved within that design process early on to save time. And when you have actually implemented all those changes and relaunched your implemented website, or relaunch, or what you would call it, collect the data again. Because data is knowledge, and knowledge is power. And the more you know about your user, the more you can implement that to your website and make sure it's meeting their needs. And that is going to convert. That's where the money is going to come in. And I would say, you know, that's how you UX and strategize with design. Drop the mic.
Easy.
Yeah? No, I think it's so important. And just, you know, the users, they have my heart.
Yeah. At least this is a good head start to getting started with this, using metrics to analyze your data and work from that on.
Yeah, and just know that this can be implemented with any size of a project. If you're having a big project or a small project, you can totally kind of optimize it to the size of your project.
Yeah.
You know.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for watching. We had so much fun with you here today, and we hope we're able to answer all your questions. And hopefully you sign up for our digital cookie.
Yes.
And get that UX review. We're going to dig some dirt on that website.
Totally.
Poor winner.
And again, remember you'll get the slides from the webinar, so we won't have to,
You get the slides, and you get the overview sheet of the UX metrics, and you get the matrix map on being able to prioritize your KPIs.
It's like an Oprah Winfrey show here.
I know, cars for everyone. I would love to take part. Maybe she will see this. Hey, Oprah.
I don't know.
Let's see. Yeah. But thank you guys for being here. Have a nice day.